Thank you very much for coming, one early in the morning and two on a 1:44 day. So Rajat wasn't familiar with that particular section reference, but it's a reference that actually explicitly prohibits people gathering. So I'm really glad that you have chosen to gather in front of us today. It's a private event, so there's no issue. It's a private location, so there's no issue about the act applying here. So particularly grateful for your presence here. We are in conversation. My guest is Rajat Gupta. I'm going to introduce him in his language, which will also set the tone for how the book is written. So he introduces himself in the following way. I'm an orphan, immigrant, businessman, leader, philanthropist, role model, convicted felon. That many chapters in this book. I will add to it, book writer and one who has served the time imposed on him by society. You heard all the other sort of factual versions of his resume, so I won't repeat it, but we will get into it as the conversation goes along. I'm also going to try something different, which is not focus on events and details, both of which you will get some of it from the book and a lot of it from the press and other material that are in the public domain. So we will stay away from who said what, when, where, and the sort of clock on the audio tape, if you will, but instead explore sort of the human side of this. I chatted briefly with Rajat, and Rajat said, bring it on, because he prefers to do it somewhat spontaneously and without too much preparation, having done it a few times now. So Rajat, I'm going to start with a quote that I like, that I suspect that you might agree with or you might not, but let me at least say it. So in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Albus Dumbledore says, "It is our choices, Harry, that show who we really are, far from our abilities." I'll take the editorial liberty to add the word and contributions and accomplishments to that. In the book, you appear to hold some choices responsible for what followed. For instance, mentoring Anil Kumar and befriending Rajaratnam. And then, of course, famously not taking the stand. But yet you don't seem to hold yourself responsible for those consequences. We're not here to make that judgment. You have been held to account in a court of law on the higher criminal charges. And yet you deny the crime. But on the lower ethical charges, the day-to-day stuff, Rajat, there appears to be no sign of contrition. So if I could ask you this question about choices. One, do you agree that choices make for a life? And if so, what choices would you re-examine, and what road would you have taken that you had not taken?
So, just to start with the few names you mentioned, it is relatively easy in hindsight to question those choices. But I can tell you this, just take the case of Anil Kumar, right? I mentored him, but I mentored dozens and dozens of other people. It's not like I made a choice to mentor him versus many others. And I feel that it's an obligation, if you're in a position to be helpful to someone, to mentor somebody, you should always do that. So I'm not very choosy about mentoring people. I think it's your obligation to do that. We talk about Rajaratnam. Now there is revisionist history But at that time, he was a star in the financial world. He was considered one of the best minds. I actually, when I associated with him, I checked it out with the leaders at Goldman Sachs, Hank Paulson and Gary Cohn, who went on to become Treasury Secretaries of the United States government. They gave him a glowing recommendation on his both his philanthropic mindset, his capabilities, and so on. So it's nice to say later on, in hindsight, should you have associated with them or mentored Anil Kumar. I don't think they were terrible choices. I take full responsibility for the choice of not testifying. That was my decision, mine alone, and nobody else's. And I regret that. I wish I would have testified. That doesn't mean that the outcome necessarily would have been different, because the outcome, in my mind, was very much driven by the times and what was going on in the context or what was going on in society at that point in time, and less to do with actually the merits of the case. That's the case I make in the book, as you know.
So let me push you on this choice thing a little bit more. So with the advantage of hindsight, and I recognize it is hindsight, not forward-looking and not contemporaneous, as it were. With the advantage of hindsight, would you have taken a different fork with either individuals or situations? I know that you say, for instance, on the stand, you would have testified regardless of the outcome. So are there other choices that you might have acted upon differently, either in human relationships or otherwise?
Surely. I mean, for example, one of the things I relate in the book is that I had resigned from the Goldman Sachs board. There was a board meeting. I resigned. The resignation was accepted. The press release was, devised. It was supposed to be out, and then they came back to me and said, "Please stay back because of the financial crisis." And I, through a sense of obligation, stayed back. It was a choice that was a wrong choice. I should have basically said no once I had resigned, that I would not go back. And I can count many choices I made, which, of course, now I regret. But there are many, many choices that I made which I enjoy and appreciate that I made them. They were generally high-risk choices. When I started Indian School of Business, people said, this will be a abysmal failure. You will never be able to get it off the ground. But I'm very glad I made the choice of sticking around with it and staying with it. And now it's a preeminent institution in the country. And it will have an impact far beyond my own lifetime.
So we spoke about two words, choice and mentoring, and you've used, and I think you firmly believe that one of the things you can leave behind is aspects of your life as a role model for others. So just sort of sticking with the idea of choice and wearing the hat of role modeling it, what would you say that a young person in the audience, a current member of McKinsey or one of our young folk from Bangalore should take away about ethical and moral choices and character judgment and judgment of characters?
Well, I mean, my feeling is that you obviously have to be very careful, thoughtful about choices you make. On the other hand, I have always believed in, generally saying yes to things that I believe can have an impact. And maybe that to a fault, because I'm not very good at saying no. If somebody comes with an idea, I'm generally trying to be helpful. Sometimes you can get overcommitted doing that. But to young people, I would say a few things. One I would say is that, you ought to, whatever you do, it is very important to excel in whatever field of endeavor you have. So you have to kind of make sure that you are investing all of yourself and doing the very best you can to be good at whatever you are doing. It is important to be, when I became a management consultant, I said it's important for me to become a very good professional. Not necessarily, and there's a difference between professional development and career development. People way too much concentrate on career development rather than how do you become a better professional at whatever field you're doing. And if you are become a better professional, you'll automatically succeed in your career. And if you don't, you have already tried the very best, so it doesn't matter. I would also say to young people that you should always look beyond the immediate scope of your assignment or your job or whatever you're doing. You have to look at broader society and a much broader canvas for the impact you want to have. It's very important to think around the corner, to make an impact beyond the very specific job you're doing. I also believe that the highest impact you achieve is if you work through and make other people successful. Then you have a truly multiplier effect. You know, you kind of make other people successful. They in turn combine to make whatever your directions are more successful than ever before. There are only very few in this world who, through their own individual brilliance, take Steve Jobs, for instance, and can achieve great things. Most people have to work with other people and make them successful, and that's the impact. I also believe that, you know, if whatever field you're in, whether you're in business or whether you're in civil society or whether you're in government, you need to work collaboratively with others to have true impact on society. None of the sectors, business themselves or, you know, NGOs themselves or government themselves by an own can actually achieve what is needed to solve society's issues. And the best efforts are when these three sectors come together to a specific objective and meet that.
So back to the micro for a second. Maybe I can shift from the question of choice to a question of relationships, and we briefly spoke about you briefly spoke about Anil and Raj. I'm going to go through a series of names, and perhaps you could tell me what your relationship was with them before and what it is or will be after. And maybe, if you like, you can place a mirror in between and tell us the conversation in the mirror between the two. Since we've already touched upon Raj, and he is central, at least to the second part of the book, or to all of the book in a manner of speaking, tell us about your relationship with Raj and your serendipitous subsequent intersection with him in prison, and sort of put the whole thing in context for us.
Well, you know, to set the context, Raj I knew of because of his reputation as a great investor before I ever met him. The reason I actually met him in the end was because he was a great benefactor to the Indian School of Business. Even though he's not Indian, he's Sri Lankan. He looked at the project and he gave a very substantial donation to the Indian School of Business. That's the first time I met him. The government tried to portray that he was a great friend of mine. He was not a great friend of mine. We had a professional relationship. I gave him some money to invest. We then contemplated starting a private equity and investing firm together. In the end, he did not. He kind of separated himself from that endeavor, and I worked with some other people. So I had respect for Raj going in as an investor and through people I'd heard about. And over time, I got to know him a little better. But it was a very business relationship, professional relationship. We never visited each other's homes or did vacations together or anything like that. I would say that once I learned that he had, and which is detailed in the book, again, I don't want to go into the details, but he did, I trusted him, I invested a lot of money with him. He did not treat me well in that. He, in fact, defrauded me of some of that money and so on. But at the same time, I would have to say that he was offered, and I have a great deal of respect for him, he was offered 5 years off his sentence to testify against me. And he decided that he did not because he had nothing to say that would. And that is a lot. That, for somebody who got a 11-year sentence, if you get 5 years off, to say that I will not testify shows character. And I met him in prison. I told him, the exact conversation was, I told him, Raj, you realize you're the reason I'm here. But I also want to thank you for not testifying against me, because that he could have made up anything he wanted and got 5 years off.
So, taking that as a little bit of a microcosm, do you think you need to hold a composite view and relationship with Raj, or you just hold pieces, some not so good, some good, like the last bit you mentioned? So is the book made up of many pages, or is it a book?
I'm not sure I follow your question. I mean, I've portrayed Raj the best I can in the book, and the pluses and minuses on both sides. As for going forward, he never was a dear friend, so he's not going to be a friend going forward, per se. Your broader question of relationships is interesting because, when you are in business and when you are doing the types of things I did, there are a lot of what I would call acquaintances. They are not friends. There's your business network, and it's a network of mutual benefit. There are things. I had a vast network. I knew lots and lots of people in many fields. I knew probably more than half the CEOs of the Fortune 500 around the world. I worked a lot in global health. I worked a lot in overall in philanthropy and education. I was well acquainted with the business leaders in this country. But many of them, few of them were friends, but vast majority were a part of a business network that you have to cultivate in order to get some things done. When I started the institutions here, to just take an example, Indian School of Business and the Public Health Foundation of India, I was able to persuade many, many business leaders, and I see a couple of them in the audience here, to contribute to that cause. And that's a very, very useful use of your network to be able to raise money for a good cause. So there are relationships like that. Now, after all this has happened to me, the friends have stayed friends. Many friends have walked away. But the business network, I don't have that much of a use of my business network. I mean, I'm not the CEO of McKinsey anymore. I don't need to cultivate clients. I don't need to do all of those things. So I'm not sure the direction you headed with the question, but there were 5,000 names on my Rolodex. Do I keep in contact with them? No.
No, sorry, I didn't mean it quite that way. I just meant for a complex character like Raj in your life, do you judge that as complex and not composite, or do you try to make it a composite? So is Raj in your book okay, to use a colloquial term, or he's A and B and C and D and there's no need to put it all together?
You make your own judgment. I mean, I have... see, one thing I'll tell you about the book is that it is simply straight from the heart. It's not anything that I've tried to manage or, so you take it unvarnished and you can draw your own judgment of what it is. That's yours.
Let me move on to the other relationship. And before we get to Anil Kumar, since we've spoken a little bit about him, tell me a little bit about your relationship with an institution, many institutions, but McKinsey in particular. And again, if you could look at it before, after, and the mirror in between.
I mean, McKinsey is a very special institution. I spent 37 years in McKinsey. I owe my entire professional success to McKinsey. They trained me. They taught me critical thinking. They taught me how to work in teams. They taught me leadership in many, many ways. So I am a product of McKinsey completely. And that will never change my feeling and the fondness for the firm in what it helped me do. It will never change. I hope that McKinsey, in its turn, will recognize the contributions that I made to McKinsey. I led McKinsey for many, many years. I changed it in fundamental ways that are generally for the good. And the global footprint of McKinsey was, in a sense, created by me. The new governance system was placed by me. The external orientation and the desire to work on societal problems. This was not what McKinsey did before, primarily solve business issues. But I was the person who said, listen, the hardest problems are not business problems, they are larger societal problems. And we have skills that can be helpful to that. And that's an initiative that we should take. And I was very much at the forefront of that. So I hope I improved McKinsey in some ways. But the debt I owe to McKinsey for who I am in a professional sense is incalculable. I always owe that debt. Did I agree with how they reacted after I was charged? No. I thought the title is Mind Without Fear. I thought they got afraid. There is a principle that says you're innocent till you're proven guilty. I was just charged. I was not proven guilty. And yet the actions they took, I would have not taken when I was in. So I don't know why they did it. It's entirely up to them, but I was disappointed. I was hurt because this is an institution I gave 37 years of my life to.
So sticking on the topic of relationships for just a second more, and you can choose which of these you answer, but your relationship with, or your observations about America and the US criminal justice system. And then I'm going to ask you about your family, which you write about very poignantly in the book. So we'll come to the family next. But
the American justice system, it is a pretty good justice system, but it doesn't get it right always. I mean, the fact is that there are more incarcerated people in the United States than any other country per capita in the world, or in absolute numbers. There are about 3 million, 2 plus, almost 3 million incarcerated people. There are not that many bad people in the United States. There's something wrong with the justice system. And I have seen the underbelly of the justice system. It is a system which does get it wrong many times. And it is because of the prosecutorial system, which is a win at all cost system, where you are basically, the prosecutors have unchecked powers. They can tamper with witnesses, they can doctor evidence, they can continue to tell falsehoods in court without getting reprimanded. And I've seen that practiced in my case. I've seen that practiced in many, many. I interviewed 40 different prisoners when I was there in their cases. And I can tell you at least a quarter of them do not deserve to be there. And so the criminal justice system in the US needs extensive reform. It is now being realized and first steps are being taken. That does not, say that it is not a system that's worth fixing. It's fundamentally maybe a good system. It's not a terrible system. It doesn't need to be, but some reform needs to take place. And if I look at criminal justice systems around the world, what I read of the criminal justice system here, you need a hell of a lot of reform here too. I mean, sometimes it is clearly justice delayed is justice denied here. That's obvious in many cases. So
Rajat, if I could push back on that, others might agree with you that the American criminal justice system is flawed, but they might suggest that it is flawed because it is in favor of those who have access and acquaintances and money and lawyers and generally form part of the establishment. So it would be almost exactly the wrong reason, the opposite reason why they would hold the criminal justice system to be flawed, which is that the defense generally gets away leniently, and they do so because of access. And you seem to be suggesting almost the opposite.
Well, I mean, let's take the context of my own case. 2007 and 8 was the greatest financial crisis in the history of the United States in a generation. The underlying causes of the financial crisis actually were reasonably well known. It's not that great a mystery. You've been a banker, you know it. What was impacting was actually Main Street, right? Main Street suffered enormously. People were losing their jobs, their pensions were getting decimated. They were in fact very angry at the system. What did the criminal justice system do? What did the prosecutors do? They could not bring even one executive of any financial institution of consequence to justice. It proves your point, but the point is the criminal justice system is flawed when you can't bring a single executive to justice. Yet, they did was to fine each of these financial institutions billions of dollars. Now, and said they did wrong. Now, institutions don't do wrong. Individuals in institutions do wrong. They did not bring any one of them to justice. And yet, the marijuana dealer kid who is in the corner gets 20 years for dealing marijuana on the street corner. That is not a fair justice system.
Tell us a little bit about the support from the family, and you write very eloquently and poignantly about that in the book, particularly at those difficult moments when life in an otherwise easy prison got really difficult. So,
well, I think, it was when we were going through the ordeal, I think the best thing I can say to you is that I'm fortunate to be surrounded by women. I have 4 daughters and 4 granddaughters and my wife. And when we were going through all these difficult times, it was a very simple conversation. Generally, the conversation in the family was anything bad happened, and it happened many times. I would ask Anita and the girls, "Are you okay?" And they will reply, "Are you okay?" So the real feeling was we were all worried about whether the other person was okay. So I was very worried about my family saying, are they okay? Are they going to be able to handle this? And they were all constantly worried about, am I okay? Am I doing fine? Am I being able to handle it? And it was that simple conversation that gave you this feeling of there is somebody looking after me. And this happened throughout the process, throughout the trial. This happened when I was in prison. There were moments of, I would only say, moments of terror punctuated by reasonably calm times. When I was put in solitary confinement was a time which was quite difficult because they put me into solitary confinement without any particular, it was a trivial infraction if there was even one. But the draconian part of it is that you are not really allowed to communicate with anybody. So I couldn't tell my family that I was being put into solitary confinement. I couldn't inform them. I had visitors coming from Europe and India and other places to visit me over the weekend. They came and they only discovered I was not in solitary confinement, could not visit with them. So that carried on for 7 weeks. I was in solitary confinement for 7 weeks, and it was a very challenging time. But it was also what shall I say? It was Vipassana for 7 weeks. It was a time for reflection. It was a time for really going deep within yourself. And I was fortunate enough to have the Bhagavad Gita, which they could not deny me. They tried to take it away from me. And basically, I said, "This is my Bible. You have no right to take it away from me." And they, in the end, relented. And I had a chance to, which I would have never had, read the Bhagavad Gita cover to cover 6 or 7 times and drew a lot of inspiration. I actually have a chapter in the book that is called the Shu and the Bhagavad Gita, which means Shu is the euphemism for, it's called special housing unit. It's a euphemism for solitary confinement. It has very nice description, nice, I shouldn't say nice, it has a pretty good description of what solitary confinement is and what they do. I think it is, the UN declares it torture after 2 weeks. It really is torture. But if you have the right frame of mind, you can deal with it, which I would say in the end I gained more from it than I suffered.
So, since you mentioned the Bhagavad Gita and you also refer to couplets and lines from Rabindranath Tagore throughout the book, I would really encourage you to look at pieces of that. Let me ask you one sort of philosophical question and one practical question. So the philosophical question is this: after all of this, do you think that Indians or Indian origin people in the United States have, generally speaking, a different view of morality and ethics than others from the West? Or do you think human beings are human beings and you can draw a normal distribution through them?
No, I think generally human beings are human beings. I don't think there is any different. But I do think that most of us coming from here who grew up with the ethos here, or the philosophy, have a certain life philosophy. I imbibed a lot of that from my father, my interactions with my father in my teenage years. I also would say that the general philosophy that is embodied in, and I recently, as I said, read the Bhagavad Gita a number of times, I subscribe to, and it's a very liberating philosophy. I mean, the simple idea that, the famous shlok, Karmanye adhikarastu ma phaleshu kadachan, I won't go through all of it. It basically says, listen, you have a right to work. You have an obligation to do the very best, but you shouldn't be attached to the fruits thereof. That's a very liberating philosophy, because once you do that, then you don't care about what the outcome is. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. As long as you're doing the right things and you're doing the very best, that's important. When things like what happened to me happen, then the idea that, there is a very wonderful shlok in Gita that says, if you can be the same through happiness and through sadness, through good things and through bad things, if you can be equanimous throughout that process, then you've really achieved something. And if you can imbibe that philosophy, life is a journey. It's a series of events. It doesn't really matter. Nothing is inherently good or bad. It's really what you make of it. So these kinds of life philosophies that I find very, very both liberating, inspiring, and you have the ability then to deal with whatever comes your way.
But is that kind of moral view different from one that comes from a Ten Commandments view or a much stricter code-based view, do you think, or not?
I am not a scholar of comparative religion, but I can only tell you that, it's very easy to make the transition from saying that the true philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita to kind of a fatalism that says, and it then robs you of the incentive to excel,
right,
and to do very well. So you have to separate that. But I do think Western philosophies themselves judge a little bit too much on results and not on effort. The idea of, making the effort and doing the right things and doing the best you can.
So let me ask you my practical question, and this is as a marketing and branding consultant for 37 years at McKinsey. If you had consulted with a brand that had risen and was pristine and had fallen, you might have suggested as a consultant contrition, widespread forgiveness, lessons learnt, and moving on. And yet, your approach is perhaps to restate innocence, somewhat selectively forgive. Is that an accurate characterization? And if so, why choose this path purely practically?
Well, first I have to challenge your basic premise. I never did anything in my life to build a brand or a reputation. It has nothing to do with that. Whatever I did, whether it be in McKinsey or whether it be in my philanthropic ventures, I believed was the right thing to do and a need at that point in time. It was not to build a brand. So, at a very highest level, I don't really care what my brand is. It doesn't matter. Yes, the brand suffered a lot, but so what? I don't even think about that. I don't think so much about what other people think of me. I think more about what I'm supposed to do. Am I doing the right thing? So to me, writing the book was about doing the right thing because it was about inspiring young people. I wrote the story because of two things. One, it's an interesting story. If you took the name Rajat Gupta away from it, some Mr. X, it's still a very interesting story. Second, it's people, everybody in this audience can relate to some part of it, I'm sure. And they can see themselves in it. And they can hopefully derive some inspiration from it. And that was the purpose of writing the book. It has nothing to do with repairing a reputation or doing something, none of that.
So we are in a literature festival, and this is a book. The book is extremely well written with the collaborator Ellen Daly. Purely, at least, if not from the storytelling point of view, which is rather compelling, read it for its prose and its economy of words. The English construction is absolutely fantastic. So with that, I'm going to ask you to take the remaining 6 or 7 minutes to ask something of Rajat. The only thing, my contribution is going to be that we will keep the conversation civil and we will keep the conversation brief, and all statements will be followed by a question mark. Please, 1, 2, 3, please. Yeah. Thank you, Rajat.
Is there a mic?
Yeah.
There.
You second. Go first, sir, please.
Please.
Okay. Why don't you ask the question? I'll get to you, sir, in 1 minute. Just ask the question. I'll come back to you. Don't worry. And I'll repeat the question. So please go ahead. Check.
I have read your book to basically understand about professionalism. We have seen
Quick question, please. Yeah.
places currently where people have, through the professional ethics or level of walking right, but then due to mistake they have fallen to waste. Does this book actually it start of your second act, or it's a medium of a redemption, or it's just a story that...
Okay, so the question is, this is Bhavesh, and he asked the question, is the book a story of a rise and a fall and a start of a second act or not?
Well, this is for you to interpret. I mean, as I said to you, I told you why I wrote the book. You can interpret it any way you want. I don't know that it's anything to do with the start. You can ask the question, how do I spend my time now? I spend the time in the same way as I did before in many ways, which is that I am very active in a number of philanthropic areas that I'm interested in, which is primarily education and public health. And then I have added to that reform of criminal justice system in the US, which is a personal passion now. So now I'm 70 years old, and I will spend most of my time in philanthropic activities. The last 25 years, it was probably 50-50 in terms of business activities and other things. So I have not analyzed this. There's no particular strategy behind this. It's just I'm going to spend my time as I feel how I want to spend my time.
Thank you.
It's a very touchy story. I am extremely moved on that. Only one question I have as I read through that. Were you overwhelmed by Rajaratnam? Because there were many occasions in which you could have taken on Rajaratnam hands-on.
We got the question, sir. Were you overwhelmed? Was he a larger-than-life figure, I think is the question. Can we get the mic to the back to the young lady in a quasi-green shirt, please? Yeah.
No, I was not overwhelmed. It was a pressure of time and things like that, which I could have sued Rajaratnam, but I've never sued anybody in my life before, so I was hesitant. I thought when I knew that he had not done something right, I confronted him, but I had not sued him, and then events overtook, and he was arrested and so on. So that there was no question of being overwhelmed. It was more circumstance of timing.
Please, ma'am.
Yeah, hello. I read your book cover to cover. As a fellow US resident, I want to first
Louder,
express-
please, louder.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
I read your book cover to cover. I really sympathize with your experience, especially as a fellow US resident. My question to you, as somebody being very interested in the Bhagavad Gita herself, is can you point to exactly how you would approach your work, especially in the public sphere, differently after having had time to immerse yourself in the Gita in the way that you did? And I really am amazed that you were able to do that.
Any more questions?
I was, let me just answer that quickly. I was always a fan of the Bhagavad Gita. I mean, the idea, some simple philosophy of a karma yogi, I always imbibed throughout my life. So it wasn't that much. The inspiration that I've taken beyond that is the idea of, equanimity, idea of being able to put everything in context. There are many lessons that I internalized more during this time. But I have to tell you that throughout my years in leadership in McKinsey, I was always fond of a philosophical aspect, both of Bhagavad Gita and many others. And I used to always open conferences or partners' conferences by reading poems of different kinds, to the extent that once I read the poem, The Road Less Taken, which was a famous poem. And after the conference, one of my partners wrote me a letter saying, I'm resigning from the firm. Because I said, why?
Wonderful.
He said, well, I want to take the road less taken because this is and I want to go and do something different. So I don't know how impact it has, but it did have a tremendous impact on that individual.
So the benediction is going to go to the gentleman in front of the camera, please. Yeah.
My question is, sir, that those 7 weeks of solitary confinement for you, when you went through Gita 6 or 7 times, what was your change in mind when you went through the Gita for first time, when you went to the Gita for during that time, for the 6th or 7th time? What was the thought process that changed in you?
Yeah, I think the fundamental thing that changed was a complete acceptance of my situation and a full realization that where I found myself, I shouldn't necessarily feel sorry for myself, pity myself, or any of it. In fact, I was at peace with myself and my circumstances, without a question, and drew strength from it and wanted to see the good aspects of solitary confinement. So the change was kind of feeling this is unfair to saying this is an opportunity for personal growth and self-growth.
We'll have to leave it there. So there it is, Rajat Gupta's book, judge for yourself whether it should be read in chapters or as a whole. Yeah? Thank you.